Marcus Bear Thompson had 20 seconds to choose between his own survival and 3 dying children protected by a wounded wolf. What this Vietnam veteran chose brought 400 Navajo warriors thundering across the Arizona desert. At sunrise, August 1976, Arizona desert. Marcus Bear Thompson was checking fence lines when the desert turned angry, and the sky disappeared into brown fury. The sandstorm had been building all day. Not just wind, but something malevolent, like the desert itself was trying to erase everything that lived. Bear had survived enough hell in Vietnam to know when nature was declaring war, and this felt like the kind of storm that takes prisoners. He was 45 years old, a Vietnam veteran who'd been working this stretch of Arizona desert since he came home with nightmares and nowhere else to go, finding peace in the silence that only the desert could provide, where ghosts couldn't follow and memories couldn't ambush a man's sleep. The ranch wasn't much to 100 acres of red rock and stubborn grass, a few head of cattle tough enough to survive where most things died. But it was his, no sergeants, no orders, no friends bleeding out in rice paddies while he tried to hold their guts inside their bodies. Just silence, wind, and the kind of emptiness that let a broken man breathe again. But today, that silence was about to shatter. The storm hit like artillery. One moment Bear could see the fence line stretching toward Monument Valley. The next he was blind in a wall of sand thick as concrete. The truck's headlights couldn't cut more than 3 feet through the brown hell that had swallowed the world. He should have turned back, should have driven to the ranch house and waited it out like any sensible man would do. The storm was big enough to sandblast the paint off buildings, to bury roads, to kill anyone stupid enough to be caught in the open. But then he heard it, crying, human crying, high and desperate, and so faint he almost missed it under the freight train roar of wind and sand. Children's voices, multiple voices, coming from somewhere ahead in the storm. Bear cut the engine and listened, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a moment, he thought it might be the wind playing tricks. The desert could make sounds that fooled men into seeing things that weren't there. But no, there it was again, weak, terrified, definitely human, and definitely young. Every survival instinct screamed at him to get back in the truck and drive away. He'd learned in Vietnam that heroes died young and ugly, and he'd used up most of his luck already. The smart play was to assume his mind was playing tricks, radio for help when the storm passed, and hope for the best. But those voices, they sounded like the children he'd tried to save in a village outside Da Nang, the ones who'd died anyway, while he held their hands and promised everything would be okay in a language they couldn't understand. He'd failed them, he wouldn't fail again. Bear grabbed his flashlight and emergency kit and stepped into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, trying to lift him off his feet and hurl him into the rocks. Sand filled his mouth, his nose, his eyes. He couldn't see his own hands, but he could still hear the crying. Following sound in a sandstorm was like trying to track smoke. The wind bounced voices off rocks, made them seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. Bear stumbled forward, using his hands to feel for obstacles, following the faint sound of human desperation. Then the flashlight beam caught something that made his blood freeze. A cave, cut into the red rock face about 50 yards ahead. Natural shelter, the kind that might save lives in a storm like this. And from inside that black opening, the crying was getting louder. Bear fought his way to the cave entrance, sand cutting his face like tiny knives. He called out as he approached, not wanting to startle whoever was inside. "Hello, I'm here to help." The crying stopped. Then, from deep in the cave, came a sound that raised every hair on his neck. A growl, low, warning, absolutely feral. Something was in there with those children, something big enough to kill them all. Bear hesitated at the cave mouth, flashlight beam cutting into the darkness. He had maybe 10 minutes before the storm got bad enough to kill him if he stayed outside. But whatever was in that cave sounded like it had no intention of sharing. The smart thing would be to back away, radio for wildlife control, let professionals handle it. But then one of the children started crying again, and the sound cut through 15 years of carefully constructed emotional armor, like it was tissue paper. Bear Thompson had left 3 children to die in a Vietnamese village because he'd been ordered to retreat. He wouldn't leave children to die again, not for anything. He stepped into the cave and came face to face with a family that would change his life forever. The flashlight beam revealed a sight that defied everything Bear thought he knew about the natural world. 3 children, Native American by their features and traditional clothing. The youngest couldn't have been more than 5, the oldest maybe 9. They were huddled together in the deepest part of the cave, surrounded by scattered rocks and debris from where part of the ceiling had collapsed. And standing between them and Bear, massive and magnificent and clearly injured, was a gray wolf. The animal had to weigh over 100 pounds. Its thick fur was matted with blood where something, probably falling rocks, had gouged its right front leg. But despite the obvious pain, despite the terror of the storm raging outside, it hadn't abandoned the children. It stood guard over them with the fierce protectiveness of a parent defending its young. When the wolf saw Bear's light, it bared its teeth and let out a warning growl that echoed off the cave walls. The message was clear: these are mine. I've been protecting them. Don't come any closer. Bear had maybe 8 minutes before the storm outside became truly lethal. 8 minutes to somehow establish trust with a wild predator. While 3 terrified children watched from the shadows, he did the only thing he could think of. He started talking. Easy, friend, easy. His voice was the same calm tone he'd used to talk wounded soldiers through their fear. I'm not here to hurt them. I'm here to help. The wolf's ears twitched. It was listening. I can see you're hurt, Bear continued, never taking his eyes off the massive animal. And I can see you've been taking care of these little ones. But that storm out there, it's going to kill us all if we don't work together. Thunder crashed overhead, and sand began filtering down from cracks in the cave ceiling. The storm was getting worse. Bear slowly reached into his emergency kit and pulled out a first aid bandage. He held it up where the wolf could see it, then very carefully tossed it halfway between them. For your leg, he said. I know it hurts. The wolf sniffed the air, testing Bear's scent, his intentions. For a moment that felt like forever, man and beast regarded each other. 2 creatures who had no earthly reason to trust each other, brought together by circumstance and the simple fact that sometimes survival meant taking impossible risks. Then the smallest child, a boy with enormous dark eyes, spoke up from behind. The wolf, Ushki, he said in a tiny voice. Ushki, he's like you. The wolf's head turned slightly toward the child, ears perked. Whatever the boy had said, it meant something. Bear didn't speak Navajo, but he understood the tone. The child was trying to mediate, trying to tell his protector that this strange man might be trustworthy. Ushki, Bear repeated, pointing to the wolf. Is that his name? The middle child, a girl of maybe 7, nodded slowly. Ushki. He found us after. Her voice broke, and she buried her face against her older brother's shoulder. The oldest boy, who couldn't have been more than 9, but carried himself with the gravity of someone much older, looked directly at Bear. Our parents died, he said in clear English. Ushki has been taking care of us. Bear felt something crack open in his chest. He knew that look, the expression of a child forced to grow up too fast, to carry responsibilities that should have belonged to adults. He'd seen it on his own face in mirrors after his father died when he was 10. How long? Bear asked gently. 5 days, the boy replied. We were supposed to go live with relatives, but they wanted to separate us, send us 2 different families, so we ran. 5 days. 3 children, the youngest barely out of diapers, had survived alone in the Arizona desert for 5 days, and this wolf had somehow kept them alive. Bear looked at Ushki with new respect. The animal hadn't just stumbled across the children, it had committed to them, had chosen to become their guardian, their provider, their family. What's your name, son? Bear asked the oldest boy. Tommy. This is my sister Sarah, and my little brother Jake. I'm Bear, and I'm going to get you all out of here safely. All of you, he added, looking directly at the wolf, including Ushki. The storm outside reached a new level of fury, and the cave shook as if the earth itself were trying to tear apart. They had maybe 5 minutes before the ceiling came down, or the sand filled the entrance completely. Bear made a decision that went against every piece of survival training he'd ever received. He put down his flashlight and slowly, very slowly, extended his hand toward the wolf. "I know you don't know me," he said to Ishki. "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I give you my word I will protect them the same way you have, with my life if necessary." The wolf studied him for a long moment, those intelligent amber eyes seeming to look straight into his soul. Then, incredibly, the animal limped forward and sniffed Bear's outstretched hand. The touch was electric, not just physical contact, but something deeper, a recognition that passed between two warriors who understood what it meant to put others before yourself. Ishki stepped aside. "Okay, kids," Bear said, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. "We're all going to walk out of here together. Tommy, I need you to help your sister. I'll carry Jake. And Ishki," he looked at the wolf, who was now standing beside him. "Rather than blocking his path, you just focus on staying close." Getting everyone out of the cave and to Bear's truck was like navigating hell. The sandstorm had reached full fury, a brown wall of destruction that turned the world into a screaming void. Bear carried Jake, the youngest, wrapped in his jacket. Tommy helped his sister Sarah, both of them clinging to Bear's belt so they wouldn't get separated, and Ishki limped beside them, using his body to shield the children from the worst of the wind. They made it to the truck with seconds to spare. Bear got the children into the cab, then did something that probably violated every insurance policy and common sense guideline ever written. He opened the tailgate for the wolf in you. "Go, friend," he said to Ishki. "It's not perfect, but it beats dying." The wolf looked at the truck bed, then at the children visible through the rear window, then at Bear. Some sort of calculation was happening behind those amber eyes. Then Ishki jumped into the truck bed and settled down for the ride. The drive back to Bear's ranch house was like piloting a submarine through molasses. The truck's headlights were useless, the GPS was dead, and the road had disappeared under drifting sand. Bear navigated by memory and instinct, following fence lines when he could find them, stopping frequently to let the worst gusts pass in. The cab, the children huddled together, still processing what had happened. Jake, the youngest, had fallen asleep against his sister's shoulder. Sarah kept looking out the back window to make sure Ishki was still there. And Tommy watched Bear, with the calculating expression of someone deciding whether this strange man could be trusted with their lives. "Where are we going?" Tommy asked finally. "My place," Bear replied. "It's not much, but it's solid, built to handle storms like this." And then what? It was a fair question. Bear had rescued them, but what came next? He was a single man living alone on a hardscrabble ranch. He had no experience with children, no legal right to care for them, and a wolf that probably belonged in a wildlife sanctuary. But looking at these kids, seeing the way they protected each other, the way they'd survived impossible odds, the way they trusted a wild animal more than most humans, Bear knew one thing for certain: he wasn't letting them go. "Then we figure it out," he said simply. Together, they reached the ranch house just as the storm hit its peak. Bear's home was a modest place to bedrooms, one bathroom, a kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace. But it had been built by a man who understood the desert, with thick walls and a foundation that went deep into bedrock. As soon as they were inside, Bear got to work. He settled the children in the living room, started a fire in the fireplace, and began assessing their needs. They were dehydrated, exhausted, and probably hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. But they were alive, and they were together. And outside, in the covered porch area Bear used for equipment storage, Ishki had claimed a corner and was methodically cleaning his wounds. Over the next few hours, as the storm raged outside, an unlikely family began to form. Bear cooked simple food: scrambled eggs, toast, hot chocolate from a mix, and watched the children slowly begin to relax. Sarah helped Jake eat. Tommy maintained his protective vigilance, but accepted Bear's authority, and occasionally, one of them would go to the window to check on Ishki. "He saved our lives," Sarah told Bear as they watched the wolf through the glass. "When we ran away, we got lost. No water, no food. We thought we were going to die. Then, Ishki found us," Tommy continued. brought us water in his mouth, led us to food, berries, roots, things we could eat, fought off coyotes that tried to attack us. For 5 days, Bear asked. Amazed. Jake, who had been mostly silent, suddenly spoke up. He talks to us, the 5-year-old said matter-of-factly. In dreams, he says he knew our daddy. Bear felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. What do you mean? Tommy looked embarrassed. Jake thinks. He thinks Ashki is sent by our father's spirit. Navajo stories, you know, about animal guides who help when someone dies. Bear looked out at the wolf, who had stopped grooming and was staring directly back at him through the window. Those amber eyes held intelligence that seemed almost human. What do you think? Bear asked Tommy. The 9-year-old was quiet for a long moment. I think it doesn't matter what sent him, he said finally. What matters is he kept us alive until you found us that night. As the storm gradually died down and the children slept on Bear's couch and spare bed, he sat by the window and watched Ashki standing guard on the porch. The wolf never lay down, never relaxed completely, even in safety. It maintained its protective vigilance. Bear understood that feeling, the hyper-awareness, the inability to fully trust that danger had passed. It was something he'd carried since Vietnam, the certainty that safety was always temporary, that the next threat was always just around the corner. But looking at these children, seeing the way they trusted him, the way they'd accepted him into their small pack, something in Bear's chest began to unknot for the first time in 15 years. He'd failed children before. In Vietnam, in that village outside Da Nang, when orders had forced him to leave the wounded behind. But not this time. This time, he would be what Ashki had been, the guardian who didn't abandon his post, the protector who chose love over survival. The next morning dawned clear and still, as if the desert were apologizing for its violence. Bear woke to find all 3 children standing at the kitchen window, watching Ashki drink from the water bowl Bear had put out for him. What happens now? Sarah asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. Bear poured coffee and looked out at his land, 200 acres of red rock and stubborn beauty. That had been his refuge from the world. It had been enough for one broken soldier trying to heal, but it could be more. It could be home. Now, Bear said, we make this work. 3 days after the storm, reality came knocking in the form of a white government sedan kicking up dust on Bear's access road. The children saw it first. Tommy, who had appointed himself lookout, came running from the porch where he'd been feeding Ashki strips of venison. Car coming, he announced, his young face tight with worry, official looking. Bear set down his coffee and walked to the window. The sedan was moving slowly, deliberately, the way authority approached when it meant business. Behind the wheel, he could make out a woman in a dark suit, talking into a radio. Child Protective Services. Had to be. Kids, Bear said calmly, go to your room. Take Ashki with you if he'll come. Are they here for us? Sarah asked, her 7-year-old voice small with fear. Bear knelt to her level, meeting her eyes. I don't know yet, but whatever they're here for, we'll handle it together. Okay. The children disappeared down the hallway, and Bear heard the soft sound of the back door opening. Ashki wouldn't go inside. The wolf was still too wild for that, but he'd position himself where he could protect the children if needed. The knock on the front door was firm, professional. Bear opened it to find a woman in her 40s, Native American, with kind eyes but a mouth set in hard lines. Her badge read Jana Yazzie, Navajo Nation Child Services. Mr. Thompson, she said. I'm here about the children. Come in, Bear replied, stepping aside. Can I get you coffee? This isn't a social call, but she entered anyway, her eyes taking in the modest living room, the children's belongings neatly ranged, the sense of order and care that pervaded the space. The children are safe, Bear said simply. They're fed, clean, and protected. That's what matters. Jana Yazzie studied him with sharp intelligence. 3 Navajo children disappear from state custody. 5 days later, they turn up here, living with a white man who has no legal authority to care for them. You can understand our concern. Our concern? Bear asked. Where was your concern when they ran away from foster care? When they spent 5 days alone in the desert? We searched, not hard enough. Bear's voice remained calm. but there was steel underneath. Those kids survived on their own because the system failed them, because someone decided it was more important to follow procedures than to keep a family together. Jeanette's expression softened slightly. Mr. Thompson, I understand you mean well, but these children need to be with their own people. They need to learn their culture, their language. They know their culture. Bear interrupted. Tommy speaks Navajo. Sarah knows traditional songs. Jake can identify sacred plants. What they need is stability. What they need is someone who won't give up on them. And you think that's you? Bear was quiet for a moment, thinking about the question. 3 days ago, he would have said no. He was a broken-down veteran with PTSD and a tendency to drink too much when the nightmares got bad. He wasn't father material, but that was before he'd seen Tommy helping his little brother get dressed each morning, before he'd watched Sarah sing traditional lullabies to help Jake fall asleep, before he'd witnessed Ashki position himself between the children and any perceived threat, injured leg and all. I think, Bear said carefully, that they've already chosen their family, and I'm honored to be part of it. Mr. Thompson, Bear. My name is Bear. Jeanette paused, studying him. Bear, that's not your given name, no. But it's who I am now. The children have relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins who are willing to take them separately. Bear said, the relatives want to split them up. Sometimes that's what's best. No. Bear's voice was flat, final. I've seen what happens when you break up families. In Vietnam, we'd evacuate villages, separate parents from children for their own safety. You know what happened to those kids? They died, not from bombs or bullets, from being alone. Jana was quiet for a moment. These children aren't war refugees, Mr. Thompson, aren't they? Bear asked. They've lost their parents. They've survived in hostile territory. They've formed their own unit, their own survival structure. And now you wanted to break that up because it's easier for the bureaucracy to manage. Before Jana could respond, a sound from outside made them both freeze. Drums. Distant at first, barely audible over the desert wind, but growing closer, growing louder. And with them, the sound of horses, many horses. Bear walked to the window and looked toward the eastern horizon, where the sun was beginning its afternoon descent toward the red rock formations. There, silhouetted against the vast sky, was something that belonged to another century. Riders, dozens of them, then hundreds, coming toward his ranch with the steady, purposeful pace of an army on the march, but not an army of conquest. An army of honor. Jana Yazzie moved to the window beside him, her face pale. My God, she whispered. How many are there? Bear counted, his military training automatically assessing the formation. 400, maybe more. The Navajo Nation hadn't just sent representatives, they'd sent everyone. Chiefs in traditional regalia rode alongside young warriors in modern clothes. Elders who remembered the old ways shared the formation with teenagers who carried smartphones alongside sacred medicine bundles. Women, men, children, entire families had made the journey to this remote corner of Arizona. And at their head rode a man Bear recognized from newspaper photos, Chief Robert Begay, one of the most respected Native American leaders in the Southwest, and a man whose word carried weight from Washington to the reservations. The riders stopped about 100 yards from Bear's house, arranged in a great semicircle that seemed to embrace his property without threatening it. The silence that followed was profound for 100 people, and for 100 horses waiting with the kind of patience that could only come from a culture that measured time and generations rather than minutes. Jana Yazzie was staring at the gathering with something approaching awe. I've never seen anything like this, she murmured. Neither have I, Bear admitted. Chief Begay rode forward alone, his horse's hooves marking a steady rhythm in the afternoon stillness. He was a man in his 60s with silver-streaked black hair and eyes that held both ancient wisdom and sharp, modern intelligence. He dismounted about 20 feet from Bear's porch and walked the rest of the way with the fluid grace of someone who had been riding since childhood. Marcus Thompson, the chief said, his voice carrying clearly in the crystal air. I have come to thank you for saving my children. Bear stepped onto the porch, acutely aware of Jana Yazzie behind him and the 400 pairs of eyes focused on this moment. Your children, all Navajo children, are my children. Chief Bege replied, "But Tommy, Sarah, and Jake, their father was my nephew. Their blood is my blood. Their survival is a gift beyond price." Behind the chief, the massive gathering remained motionless, waiting. Bear could feel their collective attention like a physical weight. 400 people focused on this conversation with an intensity that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "I just did what anyone would do," Bear said, his voice sounding inadequate in the face of such solemnity. Chief Bege smiled, but it wasn't a polite expression. It was something deeper, warmer, touched with a sadness that spoke of too many losses and too few victories. "No," the chief said, "you did what almost no one would do. You risked your life in a desert storm to save children who weren't yours, protected by a creature you had no obligation to help. And you did it not because it was easy, but because it was right." The chief walked closer, his movements deliberate and ceremonial. "May I see them?" Bear nodded and led the way into the house, conscious of Jana Yazzie following silently behind them. They found the children in the back bedroom, all three sitting on the bed with Ashki lying on the floor beside them like a furry guardian. When the children saw Chief Bege, their faces lit up with recognition and wonder. "Uncle Robert," Sarah exclaimed, jumping up to hug him. The chief gathered all three children into his arms, speaking to them in rapid Navajo. Bear couldn't understand the words, but he could read the emotions: relief, love, gratitude, and something that might have been amazement. When the conversation ended, Chief Bege turned to Bear with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of history. "They tell me Ashki spoke to them," he said quietly, "in their dreams. After their parents died, he told them to run from the foster placement, promised to keep them safe until help came. They say he has been their guardian, their provider, their family." Bear looked at the magnificent wolf, now grooming its fur with calm dignity. "Is that possible? In your world, perhaps not. In ours," the chief shrugged. "We have always known that love transcends death, that the spirits of those who pass watch over those they leave behind. Sometimes they send messengers." He approached Ashki, who regarded him with what appeared to be recognition. Chief Bege spoke to the wolf in Navajo, the same gentle tone he'd used with the children. Ashki made a soft sound in response. "I have asked Ashki if he wishes to return to the wild or stay with the children," the chief said. "He says his duty is not yet finished." Chief Bege walked to the bedroom window, looking out at the assembled nation, waiting in respectful silence. "Do you know what it means when the Navajo nation rides together like this?" Bear shook his head. "It hasn't happened in living memory, not since the cavalry wars, when we were fighting for our very survival. But there are moments, rare moments, when something happens that reminds us who we are, who we can be, who we must be." The chief turned back to Bear, his expression intense. 5 days ago, 3 of our children faced death alone in the desert. By every law of nature and probability, they should have died. Instead, they were protected by a sacred messenger and ultimately saved by a man who chose courage over safety. He paused, letting the words settle. "That is not just a rescue, Mr. Thompson. That is a sign, a reminder that the old ways, the ways of honor, sacrifice, and putting others before ourselves still have power in this world." Jana Yazzie, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "Chief Bege, these children need to be placed with appropriate guardians. Mr. Thompson has no legal standing." "Mr. Thompson," the chief interrupted gently, "has done what no one else could do, and what no one else did. Not because he had to, because it was right." He looked directly at Jana. "The children have made their choice. They wish to stay with the man who saved them and the wolf who protected them. According to our laws and customs, that choice carries weight. But state law failed these children." Chief Bege said firmly, "Let tribal law protect them." What followed was unlike anything Bear had ever experienced. The Navajo nation had not come empty-handed. As the chief led them outside, Bear saw that many of the riders carried bundles, bags, and carefully wrapped packages. Others led pack horses loaded with supplies. "The children will need a proper home," Chief Bege explained as people began dismounting and organizing themselves with practiced efficiency. "According to our laws and customs, You have proven yourself as their guardian. But guardianship carries responsibilities. Bear's throat tightened. I don't have much to offer them. I'm just a broken-down soldier trying to make it day by day. Yes, the chief said simply. But you are not alone anymore. What happened next unfolded like a vision from another time. The Navajo Nation had brought everything needed to transform Bear's modest ranch into a place suitable for raising children. Carpenters began framing additions to the house bedrooms for the children, a proper shelter for Ashki, a workshop where traditional crafts could be taught and preserved. Women set up outdoor kitchens and began preparing enough food to feed an army. Children played in the cleared areas under the watchful eyes of elders, who told stories in both Navajo and English. Teenagers unpacked boxes of clothing, toys, and books, everything 3 children would need to build a new life while staying connected to their heritage. And through it all, Ashki watched from his position near the children, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed to express approval. How is this possible? Bear asked Dr. Mary Crow Feather, a tribal physician who had come to examine the children. The logistics alone, Mary smiled. When the Navajo Nation decides to act, we act completely. Word went out 3 days ago. As soon as we realized what had happened, every family contributed something. Every person with relevant skills volunteered their time. This is what community looks like when it's working the way it's supposed to. By midday, Bear's property looked like a thriving homestead rather than a lonely outpost. The new additions had running water, electricity, and enough space for a family. Ashki's enclosure was a masterpiece of engineering, designed to be both functional and beautiful while respecting the wolf's wild nature. But it was the legal transformation that truly amazed him. We've petitioned the state for emergency guardianship, Chief Bege explained as they watched Tommy, Sarah, and Jake explore their new playground. Given the unusual circumstances and the children's clearly expressed wishes, it should be approved within days. But I'm not Navajo, no, but you are family now. We have adoption ceremonies for situations like this. Bear felt something crack open in his chest, a wall he'd built around his heart after too many losses, too many disappointments. I don't know how to be a father. I never tried before. Never thought I had it in me. Chief Bege was quiet for a long moment, watching the children chase butterflies while Ashki observed from his enclosure. Fatherhood isn't about perfection, he said finally. It's about showing up, choosing love over fear, being willing to sacrifice for something bigger than yourself. He looked at Bear directly. You've already proven you can do that. As evening approached, the Navajo Nation began preparing for something Bear hadn't expected, a ceremony. Not for him, but for Ashki. Ashki has completed a sacred trust, Chief Bege explained as people gathered in a great circle around the wolf's enclosure. He answered the call of 3 children in desperate need, protected them against impossible odds, and led them to safety. Such service must be honored. What followed was unlike anything Bear had ever witnessed. Drums began a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to sync with the earth's own heartbeat. Voices rose in ancient songs that carried the weight of centuries. Sacred herbs filled the air with smoke that was said to carry prayers to the spirit world. And at the center of it all, Ashki stood motionless in his enclosure, head high, eyes reflecting the firelight with what could only be described as dignity. When the ceremony ended, Chief Bege approached the enclosure alone. He spoke to the wolf, in Navajo, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed silence. Ashki listened intently, then stood on his hind legs in what appeared to be acknowledgement. I have told Ashki that his duty is complete, the chief said to Bear. The children are safe, protected, loved. He may return to the wild or stay as he chooses. Bear looked at the magnificent wolf, thinking about choice and duty and the invisible bonds that connect all living things. What did he say? Chief Bege smiled. He said he will stay until the children no longer need protection. Wolves adopt for life, you know, and sometimes they adopt across species. If this story is reminding you why you still believe in miracles, hit that notification bell, because what happens next will show you what love looks like when an entire nation says thank you. 2 years later, Marcus Bear Thompson stood in his expanded kitchen, making breakfast for the most extraordinary family in Arizona. The house, the Navajo Nation had built was beautiful, larger than his original home, with wide windows that looked out over the desert and a covered porch where the children liked to sit in the evenings. But the real magic wasn't in the architecture. It was in the laughter that echoed from rooms that had once been silent, in the small voices that called him Dad into languages, in the knowledge that love could rebuild anything that storms destroyed. Tommy, Sarah, and Jake, now 11, 9, and 7 respectively, had grown into confident, bilingual children who moved between two worlds with the ease of those born to bridge cultures. They could explain traditional Navajo customs to curious visitors and teach other children how to approach Ushki safely. Their trauma hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into strength, and Ushki had become something unprecedented in wildlife management. The wolf lived in an enclosure that was always open during daylight hours. He could leave any time. He chose, instead. He had become the family's protector, teacher, and friend. Wildlife biologists came from around the world to study what they called interspecies adoption behavior. Bear just called it family. The Thompson Bege Cultural Bridge Center had opened 8 months ago, built on the same land where a sandstorm had once nearly erased everything Bear owned. It specialized in teaching children about wildlife conservation and the sacred relationship between humans and animals. But it was more than just an educational facility. It had become a place where lost children found their way home. Native American children aging out of foster care, kids from broken homes who needed a place to heal, teenagers struggling with identity and belonging, they all found their way to the center. Drawn by something they couldn't quite name but desperately needed, Bear found himself parenting not just Tommy, Sarah, and Jake, but a constantly changing population of young people.